I'm Tracy Nicholas, and my co-host Tanya Carwyn and I are passionate folklore practitioners. To us, folkloring is more than a podcast. It's our commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Folkloring. In this episode, we're going to be talking about foodways. And foodways is the connection between food-related behaviors and patterns of cultural communities, groups, or society. It's systems of knowledge and expression related to food that vary from culture to culture or even within the culture. But before we get into all of that, Tanya, how have you been folkloring lately?
Well, this week I have an update that's maybe not as fun, but last time or the time before that, we talked about dyeing yarn with usnia, and that I had a lot of success just boiling the usnia and dyeing the wool on mortartins and everything. But I was very excited about the whole idea of soaking usnia in ammonia that apparently was going to draw out the color way faster and give a really beautiful red. So I gathered a whole lot more usnia, put it in ammonia, and it started drying out the color real fast. I still you know, composed myself and let it go for a week or maybe even two. And then I put my yarn in there and I didn't want to boil it in the house. And we don't have an outside heat source set up just yet. So I just let it sit in the sun, like as a sun tea kind of. I was super excited about it, and it didn't take at all. I rinsed it out yesterday, and it's like barely a little off white.
Oh, what a bummer.
Yeah, super disappointing. I find it interesting that so much information online was showing me, yeah, ammonia, and then that's kind of the modern equivalent of stale urine. I used ammonia. I followed the recipes, and it did nothing.
Good learning experience.
Exactly.
This is one of the things that we miss, like not having it passed down from our actual elders.
Yep.
And,
Yep.
So you got to do some experimenting.
And that's the thing with folkloring, right? That we think you can't really grasp anything by just reading about it. It's like an interesting read, but until you start doing it, you can't really say this works for me or this works with my usnia or things like that.
Although I will say I had my washing machine broke last week. And I went on YouTube and all of these fixes, I took the thing apart, I put it back together, nothing was working. And I finally found one about like rebooting the washing machine. And so I tried, the first way and it didn't work. And then there was a second one in the video that involved like turning the knob back and forth in a certain pattern.
It's such esoteric knowledge.
3 clicks this way, 2 clicks that way. I was like, should I light a candle? Should I have any incantations? I don't know. But then ultimately, I tried the very last thing in the video, and they're like, this probably won't work. This is like, it's a very specific to special machines, blah, blah, blah. So I do the last one. It totally worked. Totally reset my washing machine. You know what it was?
No.
It was opening and closing the door to my washing machine like 6 times within 10 seconds.
Who comes up with that? It really is like a grimoire spell.
It's true. It's true. So anyway, so my YouTube experience worked out for me.
Yeah, great. Was that your folkloring for the week or no?
No, it was not.
Okay, great. Tell me about it.
Okay, so I have 2. The first is I am doing some research because I'm always doing research. And I had gone to the library and checked out a book that I thought was sort of an academic look at African folklore. And when I got it home, it ended up just being some folklore tales. And I was like, oh, well, bummer. That's not going to serve my purpose, but okay. And I sort of put it to the side and thought, okay, I'm going to put it by the door. So I remember to take it back. And then I was on Instagram and I follow this one creator. His name is Michael the Librarian.
Oh.
And he's a children's librarian. And he's a really upbeat guy. He loves libraries and books. And he talks about how joyful he is about it, right?
Yeah.
And so
I know this guy.
Yeah. He's got the big hair.
Yep. Yep.
And he was talking about this children's book, and he was saying, I love this writer. This writer is amazing. And, check it out. Your kids are going to love it, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, why does that name sound familiar? And suddenly I realized it was the same author as the book that I had checked out.
Oh,
Yeah. And I was like, whoa, because I had no idea. Like, I completely thought it was a different kind of book. I had no idea that
yeah.
she was a children's author. All of these things. And I was like, okay, the universe is telling me something. I'm
Right.
pulling this book back and I'm going to read it because obviously it came to me for a reason.
Yeah.
My other folkloring thing for this week is food related. And I
Oh.
have been prepping some lupini beans.
Oh.
Yeah, which are delicious. I mean, basically, you brine them, you do like you do any other dried bean. You soak it
Yeah.
overnight, and then what you do is you take it and you put it in like water and you boil it, and then you put it back in the jar and you put salted water over it. And you do
Uh-huh.
that, you do that same process every day until the water is not bitter anymore. And then they're ready
Ah.
to eat. And it's like a soft shell that is not edible, and you kind of just like squeeze them and pop them out of the shell.
Uh-huh.
They're mild, but it's like a nice salty little snack. So I've been doing that every day.
That's so fun. Never
Yeah.
even heard of them. So do you ferment them or it's just the soaking process?
It's just like the brining process. It's not fermented at all. It's just like the salt and water.
Wow, never even heard of them. That sounds awesome. You eat them kind of like edamame, maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just like that.
Fun.
I think I got them on nuts.com. So,
Uh-huh. And so they're dried? They're a dried bean?
yeah.
Yeah.
I
Cool.
mean, you can get them prepared, but I wanted the organic ones and I wanted to know what the
Yeah.
ingredients were, so I did it myself.
Yeah, great. I will look them up. That sounds awesome.
So, that leads us to food. And why don't you start us off with why should we care about foodways and about cultural connections to food and food related behavior?
Yeah, why is it important even? Why don't we all just eat a hamburger, right? Food customs are an integral part of cultural identity and the formation of it. Like you recognize who your people are by the foods that they eat, right? And food customs, they serve as a tangible expression of ethnicity, regionalism, and like you belong to a group because we eat the same foods, right? So that's one thing.
Right,
Looking deeper into the folklore surrounding food gives you insights into societal structure. So you can see practices such as what foods are considered magical or in what way food is considered magical, and it can reflect the way people understand their environment and their surroundings. Also, and a thing that's coming up more and more these days is the idea of food sovereignty. Traditional foodways are a critical component of food sovereignty because traditionally they come out of the landscape, the surrounding landscape that a culture finds itself in or a people finds itself in. So the preservation of these traditional knowledge systems becomes really important for ensuring sustainable consumption and being in relation to the land that gives you the food. And through that, you get community resilience, right? If I'm in a place where I know how to get the food, when to get the food, where to get the food, how to prepare it, how to store it, that's a huge part of the resilience of the community.
right,
And it also serves as a link. Food culture serves as a link to our roots, right? So you can honor ancestors and be part of that lineage by maintaining these food cultures. And also it's an interesting thing that often people in diaspora holding on to their traditional food cultures and then maybe renegotiating certain things like, papayas might be from your country of origin, but you might not be able to get them here. But what might you substitute that is more local to where you are now? And how does that help form a newer community or a new iteration of a community in diaspora?
yeah, it's not just about what you eat. It really does reflect sort of status, class, power levels when you talk
Mm-hmm.
about like, food deserts and
Yep.
how difficult it is to get fresh food in certain areas. And
Yep.
it plays into like racial stereotypes play in
Yep.
to, certain foods being associated with certain groups. So there's really a lot in there, isn't there?
Yeah, and the power inequality thing, I find it so interesting how that keeps shifting, right? Like currently in the West, most people don't eat the organs of an animal, for example, but that used to be the most prized, right? Like the
Mhm.
pregnant women would get the organs, or the young children, or the hunter who took the animal would get the liver, for example. And that's the opposite that it is right now. And I read a story somewhere about how native people in the Americas used to throw the steaks to the dogs because that was considered the least nutritious part of the animal. And somebody was just telling me something about, I can't remember where this was, but it used to be lobster, used to be like the lowest of the low food that was given to prisoners.
Yeah, it was on I was telling you this. It was on the East Coast,
Okay.
and it was during the
Right.
Civil War, and that was what they would feed the prisoners. Yeah,
Yeah.
interesting.
Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your story.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It got out there. That's all that matters, right?
Yep. Yep.
So yeah, when you think about foodways, it does reflect like immigrants bringing their traditional foods with them and their preparations of it. It's has to do with, native foods. And so
Mhm.
how do when, an immigrant will come somewhere, how do they take the native foods that are now available to them and, infuse them with their practices? And then it becomes a new thing that
Right.
is sort of a fusion between the two. And I think that it also can be affected by the age of a person. If you grew up cooking everything for yourself and that was how everybody did it, you're used to that. But if, you are younger and you're used to eating out on a regular basis, then that is
Mhm.
going to be more of what you do.
Right.
And obviously, I mean, it has to do with where you live as well. We don't eat the
Yeah.
same things up north as they do down south, at least not regularly.
Right.
In America, I mean, it does show that we've got a lot of cultural diversity, even as we're sort of blending.
Yep.
Still, people, there are Polish restaurants and German restaurants and Italian restaurants, which are more Italian American, I think,
Yeah.
as with Chinese restaurants here. Those are really Chinese American.
Yeah.
So you see the diversity, but it also is a blending. So I think that that's very interesting. But even in other areas, like in Italy, in the north, they eat very different foods than they do
Yeah.
in the, Sicilians. And those are just, it's very different practices, very different food ways. So it can be a very small group. It can be a neighborhood. It can be a region of a country. And when people talk about even American food, I'm like, I don't know what American food is. Like, is
Right.
it burgers? Is it barbecue? I don't know. Because there is such a rich diversity here that there is no one cuisine that I could point to.
Right. And you can see such influence of like the immigrate waves of immigration that came to different places, right? Like sort of in the Midwest where you see a really big cheese culture and maybe fish, like more Scandinavian and Northern Europe, while in the South you have much more influence from African cultures and things like that. And also, of course, that's still again dictated by climate as well, because things like watermelons and sweet potatoes grow really well in the South, and they don't grow so great in Wisconsin. But in Wisconsin, it's real good to keep dairy animals. So,
Yeah, and if you look at it, I mean, it really is farmland.
uh huh.
So that's, the dairy culture and the meat culture. There's a huge meat culture in this area as well. But
Yep.
also, we have the largest freshwater lake, and it
Right.
has historically been filled with whitefish. And
Uh huh.
so that's what, when Scandinavian people came here, and I think we've talked about this before, they came here and they came to Wisconsin and further north to go to logging camps.
Right.
And so they were, cooking for big groups of people, mostly men. The fish was there, and so that's what they ate. So that's sort of what I was talking about with like it blending with what do you have and what culture do you bring.
Yep.
And it also, I think it depends on not only what you can grow, but how you can store things. And, are you salting things or are you canning things or do you have a root cellar? And
Yep.
what does your, weather and your climate dictate about how you're going to do that? And then I think the cultural aspect comes more in like, how is the food displayed and how is it served?
Uh-huh.
And even how it's disposed of, right?
Right.
I think also you have to think about health and cleanliness. I mean, I see some videos of people preparing food and I'm like, oh my God, that's on the ground. Really? Are you gonna wash that? What's happening?
Yeah.
But there's just different standards in different areas about what's okay and what kinds of containers that you use. And
Yep.
we talk about food safe containers, and there are people that don't really have that concept. And maybe they don't really have
Right.
access. They use what they have access to.
Right. And it's all so much of it, and that's just in the West, like the comparison between Holland, where I grew up, and then the US. When we talk about food safety regulations, things like we leave butter on the counter, we leave eggs on the counter, we often leave our cheese on the counter because we eat it fast and it tastes better when it's room temperature and not refrigerated.
Right.
And then, yeah, there's so many of those things, like where in the US, the whole idea of raw cheeses, raw milk, like people can get really up in arms about the safety around that, where that is really not a question at all in much of Europe. Most of the cheeses are raw, butter gets left out on the counter,
Right.
things like that.
So I think that when we look at an academic analysis of foodways, we've talked a little bit about what it all involves. But I think that when you really look at academic analysis, they will also study foods that are esteemed or shunned by a particular identity group. And we were kind of talking about this earlier with the different class levels. And we've talked about it before when we were talking about cheese. We were talking about how it at some point was being looked down on because
Uh-huh.
it was seen as like a country thing. And so you do have to look at what are those socioeconomic differences and what do people like and dislike and how does that change over time. And I think that that's part of the study of it and really fascinating stuff because in my mind, when I'm thinking about food, we always talk about different body types and how at one period in time, the Rubenesque body was the most esteemed. And in the 70s, it was like the twiggy, super skinny. Then bigger butts came back in style. And I think that it
Yeah,
is really reflective of economics, right?
sure.
Like, who can afford to be skinny right now? Rich people,
Right.
because they can
Right.
afford good, fresh food. They can afford to have it well prepared. They're not going to fast food places. They have extra time to, well, work out, but extra time to eat and to enjoy a meal and to be, mindful of the meal. And as we said earlier, you have then food deserts where people are eating junk food because that's what they can get.
Yep, exactly. And that is also the cheapest. In the US, calorie for calorie, junk food is significantly cheaper than whole food. And so if you're on a very strict budget and you still have to get the calories in, that's the easiest, cheapest way to do it.
Right. And then that's a cultural handing down as well. If that's the way you grow up eating,
Exactly.
that's the food you like, and you don't know how to properly prepare food.
Yep.
I think a lot of people don't know how to properly prepare food, no matter how rich or poor you are. But if you're rich, you can afford to get somebody else to properly prepare it for you.
Right. Actually, properly preparing foods is really something that I think so much folk wisdom goes into, and so much of it has been lost, which I think is a fascinating subject to look into. And there's an organization called the Weston Price Foundation who's done a lot of research into traditional ways of food preparation. And so we see things like in traditional cultures, how food is prepared. We no longer prepare it like that. So what you were saying with your soaking and brining your beans, a lot of people, or if you buy canned beans, they have not been soaked. And so they're full of anti-nutrients, which, if you just eat that every once in a while, it's not going to be a big deal. But if you have your health is already not in perfect condition, or you have certain other factors, eating foods that are not properly prepared can really be detrimental to your health. And we see that in things like grains apparently should be sprouted or soured. And we had the whole sourdough craze, but sourdough is actually much easier to digest and higher in nutrients than just yeasted bread. And, before we had commercially available yeast, it was all sour. Bread was all sourdough.
Mm-hmm.
So we see a lot of so when you start seeing white immigrants move to the US and getting to learn how to grow and eat corn, when corn then becomes a staple food to a people who don't have the folk wisdom to know how to appropriately prepare corn, you started seeing a lot of nutritional deficiencies. I think it's specifically in the B vitamins if corn is just eaten on the cob or not. I think it's a 5-step process to really make corn very nutritious and not at all detrimental to health, which, we eat popcorn or we eat corn on the cob, things like that, because we didn't grow up with that knowledge. And that goes for, lots and lots of different foodways.
Well, that's really interesting to me because when corn is commercially prepared, when they're wet processing it, they either wet process or dry process corn. And the wet processing will give you things like cornstarch and corn syrup, right? And what they do in order to wet process is they soak the corn, the kernels of the corn, for some number of days
Huh.
in a sulfite solution.
Yeah, nice.
And the worst part about that is that the way that the laws work in this country is even if there is a large amount, a large percentage of a certain thing, like sulfites, which is a preservative, it also bleaches food. And that's why when bleached flour can also have sulfites. But if you don't intend for something to be an ingredient, like in this case, any wet processed corn is going to have a high percentage of sulfites. But that was a process, not an ingredient they were including. So it does not have to be listed on the label anywhere because it wasn't something that is part of the ingredients as defined.
Wow.
When you think about processed foods, you really don't know what's in it. And
Right.
there's also a law,
Right.
if they want to substitute an ingredient for another ingredient, as long as it's temporary, they don't have to change their labels.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you're allergic to corn and you buy potato chips, say, that are done in olive oil, they don't have to tell you if they do it in a different oil.
Wow.
And there is no limit on what temporary means. There's no time limit associated with that. Yeah. I know. Fun times.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to our foodways.
Yeah.
Let's look at a little bit of history of the concept of foodways, because even though we've been doing it as long as there have been people, in America, the first usage of it that I could find is in the New Deal.
Uh-huh.
And the New Deal was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Uh-huh.
In the 1930s, when the Depression was going on, there was a federal program called the New Deal, and they gave work to American citizens, basically, to get the economy back on track because so many people were unemployed. And part of it, there were artists' programs as well. And one of those programs was the Federal Writers Project. and there was a guy named Benjamin Botkin, and he was the director of the Writers Project Folklore Activities. And he had field workers that would gather folk songs, the calls of street vendors, festivals, tall tales, superstitions, and foodways. And they also would use the term food lore back in the time. And so they were out collecting those things, and that's how those people were employed. And that was the first sort of recorded usage of it that I could find.
Man, how do you get that job, right?
I know, right? I mean, how cool would that be? To be like, oh,
Yeah.
I get to go collect folklore in the field and someone's just going to pay
Yep.
me. That's my full-time job. I'm in.
I know, same.
So I think we've already talked, it's a component in every culture. Every culture has their own ways. And it also would look at the importance of food events. So when you're talking about things like barbecues or food festivals and things where it is specific to that kind of event. So that's one of the things that the Folkways people look at. Also food preparation. And this involves not only what are those traditional ways, as we were talking about, but things like, shapes. When you bake bread in different shapes, what do those symbols mean? What do you carve on the top of your sourdough? And what does that mean for you? And artistic expressions associated with food. So those are
Nice.
the kinds of things that anyone who's academically looking at foodways would be looking at.
Right.
And there's an idea that's sort of akin to foodways about all of the ways that we live. And it's interesting. I'm just going to run a few of these by you, but Foodways was really one of the only ones that stuck and is still in modern usage. But there is shelterways, right? How do we live and what do our shelters look like? Clotheways, homeways, workways, schoolways, healthways, leisureways, and even deathways.
I think we should bring those words back. They're giving me shivers. They're so good.
Yeah, I love it. And so the reason that foodways stayed in contemporary usage was really down to a couple of scholars. The first one was Don Yoder, and he was at the University of Pennsylvania, and the other was Warren Roberts at Indiana University. And they both headed up folklore studies programs there. So they really focused as part of those programs on foodways, and they prepared their students to sort of uphold broad applications of the term tradition, right? And what that material folk culture is in their research.
Yeah.
And they were on the board at the Smithsonian Institution's Festival of American Folklife. And in 1969, that festival presented foodways among the programs that focused on featured states or regions or ethnic communities or occupational groups and their traditionally acquired skills and community values.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that started back in, the late 60s. And they would highlight these different things, year by year, they would highlight what, a different culture or whatever. And Foodways was always a huge part of that, based in part by these two scholars that were on the board and helping to prepare each of these festivals.
That's so great.
Yeah. And I think that also, and you probably know more about this than me, but anthropologists really view food and foodways as tools to understand individual cultures and societies in the context of sort of historical ebbs and flows and global connections.
Yeah, I mean, it's so integral to our existence, right? And then specifically within a cultural group. Yeah, if you don't know how to prepare your food or where to get it or how to store it, you're not going to do so well as a society.
Mm-hmm. So when we're looking at serving food,
Uh-huh.
ordinary everyday meals, holiday feast, and what are those ties of reciprocity between
Right.
like the preparers and the consumers? And are you in a place where you're being served? And what does that look like? And what are those relationships? And I think that food events become a rich subject for commentary about a group's cultural and social organization.
So in America, where you see the traditional carving of the turkey around Thanksgiving, it's interesting to me because that's not something part of my cultural heritage so much. So it's a little bit more easy to observe, right?
Yeah,
But so seeing that, like, it's meaningful who carves the turkey, right?
right.
So often it's like the head of the household, whoever that may be at that point, right? Is it dad or is it father-in-law? Is it the man whose house you're at? Is it the women carving the turkey in the kitchen? Like I find it interesting to observe that sort of thing. And then there's the whole, I know a lot of people these days just like throw something in the microwave or so, but at sit down meals, like who gets served first or who serves themselves first is like, that's an interesting
Right.
observation. And like here in the South, I know that, and I think I've maybe talked about this before, but I know a lot of men, when there's like a potluck or a large situation where you kind of go and serve yourself, I know a lot of the men will hold back and like want to be the last one to get the food, which
Interesting.
is yeah, I find it beautiful and respectful and wonderful and all that. But then often around the family dinner table, they will get served first.
Well, it's interesting too. There is also a hierarchy when you're talking about a sit down meal of where people sit.
Uh huh.
Who's sitting at the head of the table and who's sitting at the foot of the table. It's definitely very interesting that those rules still kind of exist and they, seem so silly. Like when I have a dinner party, I do sit at the head of the table, but it's because I've got, a long table. I usually have about 10 people for a dinner party. And at the end, I'm sitting in a chair, but everybody else is sitting on sort of long benches on either side. And
Uh
so
huh.
this position is easiest for me to jump up and get to the kitchen so I can bring the next course out.
In our house, my husband sits at the head of the table, but it is because it's closest to the door, which is must be a very southern thing. But it's a like if something were to happen, or if someone unexpected was to come in, he is like the first line of defense.
Interesting.
And when the kids were really young, we went through a little bit of a, and they were really young. We went through a bit of a period where it was like dinner table shenanigans or whatever. And I was reading, and I think it's a feng shui thing where there is a particular way to sit around the table. And we started doing that. And I remember there was it's something like the eldest daughter sits next to the mother. No, so the mother sits on the left hand of the father. The eldest daughter sits at the left hand of the mother. The youngest daughter sits across from the mother. And what was funny, it used to be my youngest, I would sit in between my two daughters, but then we moved the youngest to across the table from me. And it like, and the idea is that there's more interaction, right? There, like you are actually looking at each other more. And it's funny, we still sit like that at the table.
That's really funny. Now you're making me think. I recently binge watched Young Sheldon, and
Mm,
the father sits at the head of the table and she does sit on his left. And
uh-huh.
I hadn't really noticed that before. That's really interesting.
Yep.
And they're in Texas, so maybe that is a Southern thing.
Yeah.
Because I always thought that the father sat at the head and the mother sat at the foot, and then the
Oh,
kids sat on the sides of the table, because that's the way we did it in my house.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, and my dining room my house is long and narrow, and
Uh-huh.
so it's sort of between the front door and the back door, so I don't know where where the protector of the home would sit.
Yeah, we had this. It was funny actually. Our good friends, they have boys. They're what, 11 and 13 or almost that. And one of them is the youngest is a real trickster, and he always like when they're over here having dinner, he always tries to sneak at the head of the table, and he'll sit down before anybody else has sat down, and he'll be like, "And now I am the man of the house."
Now, when we look at folkloric commentary on food, a lot of it is either glowingly positive or very negative. And
Yep.
when you look at like festive holiday cooking, we've still got songs about chestnuts and wassailing and sugar plums. Like, no, nobody's eating that these days. Like, nobody is consuming these things.
Oh, I eat this all the time.
Yeah, but that's you. The average American is not experiencing, and sure, there'll be chestnut carts out in New York, at least. I'm sure they're in Chicago too, right before Christmas. But
Yeah.
that's just not something that I would regularly.
Yeah.
I have been wassailing, but it was years ago and it was only once. So
And we're weirdos, so there's that.
exactly. We make holiday sweets. We do gingerbread men. We do cookies as stars. And sometimes people use those as decorations on, they seal them up and use them as decorations on Christmas trees. And we paint Easter eggs.
Mhm.
We have a lot of reverence for those kinds of foods as holiday foods.
I recently saw this thing, also kind of an Easter and spring celebration with the hot cross buns,
Uh-huh.
and that you save one of the batch every year. And there was like, I think it was in Scotland, a pub that had hundreds of years worth of hot cross buns stuck on the wall. It was so great.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's funny as an Easter tradition. I always thought that having deviled eggs was an Easter tradition,
Mm.
but it was just my mom wanting to use up all those eggs that we had
Uh-huh.
found. And I think that we've talked about the negative side of, food taboos and things.
Mhm.
There are even in, like you see in different religions, there are taboo foods, and those foods are thought of as either sacred or as dirty, right? So you get both the positive and the negative folklore take on different kinds of foods. And I think that
Yeah.
too will define what it is that we feel comfortable consuming and what seems like how do people eat that? You always get into the conversation about how do people eat insects? They're comfortable with
Uh-huh.
it because that's they grew up with that
Yep.
and that's very normal to them.
Yeah, I have a story in that direction. I was born in Thailand and I lived there when I was really little. But one day, the neighbor girl came over to ask if I could come to her birthday party because, and I don't remember this. This is a story that my mom tells. And she was really excited because they were going to have dog for dinner, and it was a black one, and those were the best.
Oh,
Yep.
oh.
Yep.
That actually brings up for me, I heard a story once about Lewis and Clark. And when they were exploring America, they had hired Native Americans to be their guides. And as they were traveling across the country, the Native Americans nicknamed them dog eaters because they would eat dog. And the Native Americans did not. And so they were shocked and appalled by this. And they were like, oh, yeah, the dog eaters. So,
Huh.
yeah.
Yeah, interesting because that's also the word Eskimo means those guys that eat the disgusting raw meat
Oh, interesting.
or something like that. It's a derogatory term and
Interesting.
specifically geared toward what they're eating. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, so let's look at some different references in folklore where we find food and foodways. I think that
Yeah.
we know, some of the really popular ones like Hansel and Gretel, eating the candy house and all of that. And it was so deeply explored in the movie Gretel and Hansel,
Hmm.
a lot more than just the candy. It was there was so much about the different food and what it represented. It was really fascinating.
Yeah.
And then of course, we have the infamous apple. You've got it with, Eve, you've got it in that story, Snow White.
Yep.
Although from what I can tell, apple was once used to refer to a variety of fruits. It wasn't
Yeah.
always just the apple as we think of it today. It could have been an orange, it could have been a pear.
Yep.
So maybe not necessarily specifically apple. So there's a lot of folk tales that we know that involve food.
Yeah, those everlasting pots of porridge or pasta, or a lot of that comes out of lack of food security times, I think. But yeah.
Well, then that was what stone soup was about, right?
Uh-huh. Yep.
And then we have folk songs. And the first one that came to my mind was the Big Rock Candy Mountain.
Uh-huh.
There are folk dances. And this was interesting. I did not believe this at first, but I did my research and it's a thing. The cakewalk, which I thought of as a very kind of 50s, like
Yeah.
pop music, rockabilly kind of dance. But
Yeah.
cakewalk was actually a pre-Civil War dance, originally performed by slaves on plantation grounds. And it was first known as the prize walk, but the prize was obviously a cake.
Okay. Yeah.
That's where the terms takes the cake and cakewalk come from, because when you
Right.
won the prize for dancing, and it was always the master, the overseer that was judging, the way that the dance worked, couples stand in a square formation with the men on the inside perimeter and then dance around the ballroom. And this is a quote, as if in mimicry of the white man's attitudes, manners, a high leg prance with a backward tilt of the head, shoulders, and upper torso. And later it became a staple in minstrel shows.
Huh.
Yeah, when we were talking about folklore as resistance, and we were talking about how oftentimes the slaves would be telling their stories in resistance. I think this is another example of that, because they're making fun of the white people and the way that they walk,
Yeah.
in a very exaggerated manner, right in front of the white people who were judging them on how good their dancing was. So they really did not get it.
That's interesting. We see a lot of also folklore and festivals surrounding harvest of particular staple crops. So in France and Italy, you have a lot of ceremony and folk ways surrounding the grape harvest. In Asia, it's around rice harvesting. In Africa, you see it around millet harvest. And it's basically all over the world, you see it surrounding the harvest of the staple foods.
Right.
Like a lot of ceremony and attention being paid to the harvest of those.
Well, and that makes sense. You're obviously going to celebrate food when you're harvesting, and that is, you're going to celebrate whatever you're harvesting. So that all makes sense to me. I think we do see other festival practices that are not specifically around harvesting and bounty. When you think about trick-or-treating, right?
Yep.
That's basically give me food or, a treat, or I'm going to do something not evil, but wicked. I'm going to do something bad to you.
Yep.
So we see that. We see people dress up as food, again, Halloween, there'd be ketchup and mustard or bag of popcorn and a theater ticket. I don't know. Like there are definitely people wear food-based costumes. Vernacular architecture is another place that we see it.
Yeah.
Talking about things like a drive-in that's in the shape of a duck and serves roast duck, right? We do have, in this area, we have a place called Super Dog, and it has two massive, a male and a female hot dog, a male and a female presenting hot dog that, are on top of the building. And it's hilarious. And it's so random. And you think, why did they spend money to do that? Like, isn't that, it's a big flat roof. And you think, oh man, when they got to clear the snow off of that, like somebody's cursing those hot dogs out at that point.
I think that would be a very American thing to do those, restaurants in the shape of a duck or something like that. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere else.
Do they have the hot dog mobiles and things like that anywhere else?
Not in Holland. In Holland, it's like the hot dog that you might get on the street, from a vendor. We would get French fries or like Vietnamese spring rolls were really big when I was a teenager. But nothing, they're just like a cozy little stand, no hot dog or nothing that looks like, especially nothing that looks like the animal alive that you're about to eat.
Well, the vehicles that I've seen have all been like the hot dog cars. Those are like Oscar Mayer. So that kind of
Uh-huh.
thing is just promotional for big corporations. I don't know that that's necessarily indicative of our culture.
Sure.
Now, we also see food related stories in urban legends. We've all heard of the stories of, going to a fast food place and getting fried chicken and something horrible being in the chicken and there's a chicken
Uh-huh.
head or, some other really awful, horrible thing that was breaded and fried and nobody caught it. Those are commentaries on a couple of things. One, that we have removed ourselves from our connection to food, the fact that no one would notice that in all of the processing, that it's like a chicken foot or whatever.
Uh-huh.
And so people just aren't really connected with that process of preparing food. I think that it's also a lot of times a uh, comment on people eating out. Like, well, if you were at home preparing your own food, this wouldn't be happening to you.
Interesting. Yeah.
It has a very judgy undertone to me.
Yeah, so I think often those urban legends are also a little bit of a cautionary tale, right? Don't just eat something because you think you can, or something like that. And one of the stories that I have along those lines is people excavating a pyramid in Egypt, and they found a really beautiful big jar filled of honey. And we've all heard, right?
Right,
You get
right.
honey out of the pyramids, and it's still perfectly good to eat and everything. And so the people that were there, they were all like, "Oh, this is so great," and they were eating some of the honey, and it's so amazing. And then it turned out later on that at the bottom of that jar was the corpse of a baby.
Oh, oh, that's.
It's so horrible.
I thought it was going to be sort of like, ooh, this could be a Brendan Fraser movie, but no, no, no,
No,
no dead
no,
babies.
no, no, so horrible. And the other one that I've heard that's definitely an urban legend is so nowadays nobody says Kentucky Fried Chicken anymore. Everybody says KFC. And I heard that that was done for legal reasons because that wasn't actually chicken anymore that they put in there.
Oh, that's fascinating. See, I had always thought it
Yeah.
was a marketing thing that they didn't want to say fried because, everybody knows deep fried food is not that great for you. I thought that was all it was, but that's pretty funny.
Actually, yours is actually probably closer to the truth than mine, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah, well, what did they say what it was instead? Was it like Soylent Green or?
Well, what I heard is that they were, I don't know if it was a genetic modified or something, but somehow they were growing a kind of chicken-like animal that just had more legs and things like that. Now I'm saying it, the more ridiculous it sounds. Sorry.
No, I want to see that on some sort of sci-fi show, right? Maybe
Yep.
Tales from the Loop. Maybe they can do that in the next season of Tales from the Loop. That would be great.
So fun.
So another thing that you find is that you had mentioned earlier about our changing ways and how the organ meat used to be given to the pregnant woman or the person that needed the nutrients the most, and now we don't really eat that stuff as much anymore.
Yep.
But there is a part of the anatomy of animals that most people uh, have a lot of disgust and a lot of pushback against it. But there are areas in which people live off the land, cultures in which no part of the animal should be wasted when the animal's slaughtered. I'm sure you remember this back from your days back in Colorado, but Rocky Mountain oysters, which are also called, I did not realize this, in Montana, they're called Montana tendergroin.
Which is hilarious.
That's very funny. Or cowboy caviar.
Hmm.
And they have festivals around, Rocky Mountain oysters.
Yep.
I've never tried that. I have had goat frites, which are not fries, but they are goat testicles, and they were really good.
Yeah, I've had ram testicles and also absolutely amazing, like so delicious. And they were like sliced and breaded and fried in butter, and Lord Almighty, they were so good.
See, the way I made the goat ones, I sauteed them in butter until they were just kind of like browning. And then I served them with lemon squeezed over it.
Oh,
But I tried it without the lemon because that was the recipe I had, was like, put lemon on it. I tried it first without, and I was like, oh no. And then I put the lemon on, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing.
that's so fun. Yeah, goat maybe it's a little bit more gamey or so stronger flavored than I mean this one was like it was like I don't know, like a chicken nugget or something, really mild.
Yeah, it wasn't very strong. It was a little bit challenging with the texture,
Oh,
but it was more that it didn't have any flavor without the lemon. I mean, it tasted like salt, but that was really all I could taste.
right.
It was, astonishingly mild, but I can guess why a lot of people would be very uncomfortable with that idea.
Yeah.
So maybe we can make a shift now to talk about food and deities.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of tie-in there. And when you talk about votive foods that you're making as an offering, there is a sacred quality that is extended to those foods, even if it is a common everyday food, when
Yeah.
you're using it in a way and it represents sort of a solidarity of man with plants and animals. And again, that's what's valuable to us. And so if we're using it in a spiritual way, of course, it's important and different than using it in your day-to-day way.
Right.
I mean, you look at even in, say, the church, the Christian church, where they take the communion, and that is a way that they're connecting with the divine. They're taking that into their body, and it's the body of Christ, the blood of Christ. There's a lot of ways that food offers connection between man and the living world around us, man and spirituality, deities. And so food is a connection for us because we do consume it, we take it into our bodies, and that it becomes part of us then.
Yeah, you also just see food as one of the main offerings that are made to deities and spirits and things like that, right? And like
Right, right.
also then again, very culturally, where you see what like gnomes or house spirits often like porridge of some kind, and some of the African orishas really like hard candy or chocolate or coffee, things like that. It's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of deities that are associated with food and cooking. I did find some very specific connections between a particular deity and food.
Yeah.
Egyptian god Set is connected with lettuce, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then we have a Hindu god, Dharmothikar.
Ah,
They give white offerings too. So rice and milk and poultry, and it's very specific that it has to be white.
nice.
There is a demonic, semi-divine female called Dakini, also
Mhm.
Hindu, who is the goddess of raw meat.
So that's an offering to her? You would give that?
Yes. And then we've got Krishna, who goes into peasants' houses and pinches the butter. And I suppose that's to bless the butter.
Oh, I understood it as he would take a little bit of your butter because it's so delicious.
Oh, yeah, like pinches as in steals.
Yep.
Okay. Going back to Hindu, they make offerings of boiled rice. They mix it with sesame seeds, milk, ghee, which is clarified butter, and honey to their ancestors residing in the other world.
Ooh, sounds delicious.
Yeah, no, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah. And in ancient Greek, before any undertaking, you would make an offering as a promise to the gods in order to gain their support. Like you could bake a cake in the shape of an ox or a cow or a sheep. Now, in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Scandinavia, beer was a big part of offerings.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a big offering. And I think that there are lots of liquor related or fermented things that are made as offerings. I know that anytime I go and I put a jar in the garden and put beer in it, I definitely am praying to the gods to get all the slugs to go in to that.
Yeah, also in Mesopotamia, we find Inanna. And again, with the beer, she gets the god Enki drunk with beer in order to steal the heavenly secrets away from him. And then in Greek mythology, and as well in Welsh mythology, in the Welsh underworld, Annwn, you find a spring where wine was flowing. And then in Greek mythology, obviously, we have a lot of wine stories, lore, and used in ceremony and as offerings.
Like Bacchus.
Exactly. And of course, you see wine in countries where grapes are grown, and
Right,
beer
right.
countries where more grain is grown, and that's where the alcohol is made from.
Thinking about grains, there was an Aboriginal deity that was composed exclusively of fresh bread made of sago nut flour. And eating that bread formed a sacred bond of friendship between the participants of, whatever feast you were eating the bread at.
Which is just so interesting because that really like sounds a lot like the Catholic Church and doing communion, right? That binds you together too.
Yeah, and I think that bread is thought as a connection to the human body. It's the staff of life and all of that.
Yep.
And in the Judeo-Christian traditions, the word bread is often used as a synonym for food in general,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And it's all about nourishment. And it, like we said, it's a symbol of the Holy Spirit. Bread is a spiritual food in a lot of traditions because it is so important.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go on to some holiday foods, traditional holiday foods. And we talked a little bit earlier about some of the ones that in America and maybe Western Europe we'd be familiar with, but we tried to find some that were a little bit less well known. So in Greece, a lot of Christians will gift a red dyed egg to friends and family during Easter. It's believed that after the resurrection of Christ, Mary Magdalene went to Pilate to tell him about it. And he said that he would believe such a story, obviously the virgin birth, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the egg in Mary's hand turned blood red. And according to the legend, the egg did. And so that was why they started gifting specifically the red eggs.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And a lot of people will know about kosher foods. And there is also in the Islamic countries, we have halal food.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also very strict dietary law in much the same way. And that forbids pork and alcohol and also has to kill the animal in a very specific way. That I'm not going to go into detail because you don't need that unless you're really interested, and you can find that on the internet. And the food industry, it's the same. There are certifications and standards that they have to adhere to, just like they do with kosher food.
Yep.
There's an area of Chicago that does have a lot of halal butcher shops and restaurants. And so I definitely have seen them posting, this is certified. So there's that. Now,
Nice.
there's also in Japan, we have tea ceremonies, and those are elaborate ritualized tea ceremonies. It usually involves matcha, and it's a powdered green tea. And there are very specific etiquettes for guests entering the room, for the serving of the tea, and how you interact during the ceremony. And I think that it does reflect mindfulness and aesthetics of that sort of like Zen kind of Japanese culture.
Yeah.
In Italy, there has been the slow food movement, and I think that that's come to America.
It's all over. It's really an amazing organization. Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little about the organization? I don't know much about it.
So it definitely started in Italy, where it was this idea of like an opposition to the fast food and commercialized and packaged and pre-made food that's taken over the whole world, right? And so the idea was to preserve foodways, traditional Italian foodways, which included also heirloom seeds and things like that. So yeah, it's about like local, well prepared, very nourishing, vibrant, in season, nose to tail kind of eating. And yeah, it's definitely spread. You can they have chapters. You can become a member. I think they do. If your chapter is particularly active, there'll be potlucks and meals and things like that. And I do think
Uh-huh.
they also have a kind of like stamp of approval or something, which is called the Arc of Taste, which you sometimes will see on things like heirloom seeds or something like that. So it's kind of we're trying to preserve, because it's right also in like the number of varieties of plants that are food plants that are being grown, or the different varieties of animals. Like, for example, there's the turkey that you get in the grocery store at Thanksgiving. That's one genetic strain of turkey. Everything else is bred out. But this
Right.
particular one, the most commercially viable. So there is obviously local, there's a lot of people that are breeding heirloom turkeys and things like that right now. The same is happening with seeds. So if you see the Arc of Taste seal or something somewhere, you know that you're getting something. They're trying to preserve an ancient food that it's very delicious and it's in danger of extinction.
I don't know if you're going to know the answer to this question or not, but does this have anything to do with sort of farm to table movement that you hear about?
I mean, I would say they're parallel streams of thought. It's like a similar situation, right? Like, you can only do farm to table if your farm is local to your table.
Right. Right.
So yeah, and it's not usually like monocrops, big industrial farms that are doing this. It's small family farms that are usually an integrated whole of different crops and animals.
Fascinating. That's really interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Another thing that we have touched upon a couple of times, but I think that it bears mentioning again because we have something else to say about it, is like soul food. And we've talked about how soul food is traditionally made by African Americans in the southern United States. And it started with foods that plantation owners gave to their Black slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That was, the food that they had available to them, that they were given, what was thought as the not great cuts of meat. And we talked about this at the beginning of how you take what you have available, you bring your cultural background to the food preparation, and then you find this new fusion.
Yeah. This is actually where the term high on the hog comes from, where the plantation owners would eat the meat that was high on the hog, and they would give the people that they had enslaved like the leftover cuts. And there's actually, if anybody's interested, there's a documentary that's called High on the Hog, which is an amazing documentary that traces the African influences in the US. And it's absolutely worthwhile watching that. It's amazing.
Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we had talked earlier about Thanksgiving tradition or formal sit down meal traditions, and how, the head of the household is the one that does the carving of the turkey and that sort of thing. And I think the carving of any meat if you're sitting down for a formal meal.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's interesting too in our culture, in a lot of cultures, that although women do the bulk of the cooking, when you're talking about cooking stuff over an open flame, a lot of times it goes back to the men, right? The barbecues and the grilling out here.
Yep.
And there's specific kind of barbecue called a braai that is in South Africa. And it's the men. If you've got meat and open flame, the men are drawn to that, at least in some cases. So I think that that's interesting that in our culture, that is seen as more of men's realm, where cooking in general has traditionally been sort of the woman's task.
For sure. So one of the things that becomes very important if you're eating a more local diet, and especially if you're talking about living before refrigeration or freezers were available, you can't just harvest your food, you also need to preserve it somehow. And so there's actually, like how we do these days, food is preserved in a number of different ways that are probably not phenomenal for us and definitely denature the food. But there we have a treasure trove of traditional techniques of preservation of food. So if you're at all interested, you should definitely look into things like this. But one of the things that I always found so fascinating is fermentation of primarily vegetables, which not only takes care of any anti-nutrients that you might find in vegetables, it makes the nutrients that are there more available. It makes food tasty, and also it preserves it for a long time. So, for example, if you make sauerkraut, which would be a more Northern Europe sort of tradition, or like the kimchis in Korea, it will preserve the vegetables like pretty much until the next harvest, especially if you manage to keep it cool but not frozen. So the fermentation takes all sorts of different forms. Actually, things like salami is also a fermented product, fermented and then dried. But it's so fermentation, especially lacto fermentation, can really aid in the preserving of food, which has a lot of additional benefits other than just it preserves it.
Right. You don't think much about meat being fermented,
Mm.
but in the times that I've made a corned beef, I absolutely lacto fermented it to get it to be corned beef.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I had no idea about salami.
I was just listening to an interview with a woman who's calls herself an experiential anthropologist. She mostly is what she's trying to find is traditional food ways of westernized tribes. So she travels the whole world, and she got to spend some time with the Inuit people, where one of their like phenomenal celebrated only comes out at like really big parties food is like these little birds that they hunt and then stuff into the skin of I think it was a seal, stuff them into the skin of a seal and let them do their thing for like 6 months or so. It becomes pretty much putrefied, and the birds still have their feathers on them and everything. The whole thing kind of becomes a putrefied, jellyish situation. And this woman, listeners who had tried, did not fare very well with it because of potential botulism, maybe. But she was committed to her task, and so she did taste it. And she said she was not excited about it, but she said as you're tasting it, it's actually really mild and delicious.
I don't think I could get past that process.
I know. I think I would also, I mean, I don't know. I'd like to think of myself as very adventurous and definitely trying to be respectful of the people that are inviting me to eat their most sacred food. But yeah, that would be rough.
It would be rough.
Obviously, there's lots of other traditional ways of preserving things like drying of fruits and leafy greens or things for tea, flowers, things like that. There's also lots of people who just love to can. They put up their harvest from the garden, and also meat. You need to make sure that what kind of canning process you need for different kinds of things. But yeah, lots of folklore surrounding canning, which is really funny. In America, we have the USDA who sets out the canning safety rules, but I know that in Europe, it's definitely not that considered that big of a deal. Like for example, my mom always made jams every fall from like wild berries that we pick, and she would put the jar upside down and right side back up, and it never touched a canning pot at all ever.
Oh, wow.
And I remember the mother of a boyfriend that I had in college who always grew a huge garden. She would just water bath can all her green beans and had done so for decades, and nobody had ever died. So
That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm a little intimidated by the whole canning. I do have one of those huge tubs to put the jars in and all of that, and sterilize, but it's pining away in my basement because I'm just intimidated by it and I'm convinced that I won't do it right and I'll die.
well, water bath canning is nothing. I do have a pressure canner which I do use on occasion, but it's not my absolute favorite. And I kind of don't like the texture of, like, other than like beans or sauces or something like that. Like, I don't like a home canned soup or so.
Interesting. Yeah, and I suppose that there's also the aspect of new technology coming into play that
Yeah.
changes the way that you are preserving these foods. I remember when it was a big deal, it's probably still a big deal for some people to do the vacuum sealed food so
Yeah.
it doesn't get freezer burn when you put it in the freezer.
Yep.
So that's going to change how long you can keep food in the freezer.
Yep.
And feel like I can't see a food video at this point without someone going, and then you put it in the air fryer. Not have an air fryer.
Sous vide is also such a thing, which I don't want to boil my food in plastic.
Yeah, that seems like a terrible idea. Okay, so let's move on to things that you can do at home around foodways.
Yeah, the first one I think is really fun and very important is learn traditional ways to prepare food. So soaking, fermenting, learn to eat organ meats. It's really not as bad as you think. Learn to make sourdough bread, also not as hard as you think it is. And it doesn't, I don't know, you see things on the internet about like you have to feed it every day. Like, I feed mine once a week, I bake once a week, and that's about it. For the rest, it sits in the fridge. Learn to soak grain. So instead of just cooking your oatmeal in the morning, soak it overnight with a little bit of lemon juice or so. Much healthier for you, much easier to cook, easier to digest. Corn has its own like long process of preparation, traditional ways of preparation. And if you do follow that, the product that comes out of it is incomparable to what you might find in a grocery store. Learn to make yogurt. Also, really easy. You don't need anything but a mason jar and, like, maybe a couple of towels to wrap around the jar to keep your yogurt warm.
Mm.
Sauerkraut, also super simple. Kimchi, a little bit more. You need a little more ingredients for kimchi, but still very simple. Make your own sausages, super fun.
Yes.
Confit. We haven't actually, I meant to talk to that more, but it's basically the preservation of meat in its own fat. It sounds disgusting, sounds unsafe, but it's really not. So read up on confit. And there's like ways to salt dry egg yolks that turns them into something resembling Parmesan cheese. Also very delicious. If you happen to have your own chickens that lay too much in the summer, that's a great way to preserve some eggs.
Interesting. I'm about the same with you on the sourdough is I feed it about once a week. I don't worry about it too much. I don't bake as much as you do though. So I do end up getting a lot of the sourdough discard
Yeah.
because every time you feed it, it doubles in volume.
Yeah.
So what I have ended up doing with that, and there's lots of good recipes for sourdough discard, but my favorite one that I do all the time is called I don't know if it's pronounced picklets or pikelets,
Ah.
and it's a sourdough discard pancake.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, all you have to do is you take whatever sourdough starter you're using and you mix in some baking soda.
Ah.
And it has to be like not fed. You don't feed it before you do this. You pull it out of the fridge, and the baking soda makes it double in volume.
Uh-huh.
And you have to wait a little while to do it. But then once you've done it, you just cook it like you're cooking pancakes. It's, some oil or butter, and they are delicious. And they're not sweet. You could
Right.
add sugar to it and make it sweet like a regular pancake. To me, it's sort of reminiscent of latkes,
Ah.
the
Yeah.
potato
Yeah.
pancakes, yeah.
Nice.
And so that's how I use up my extra sourdough starter because I am a lazy baker at best.
Yeah, my absolute favorite sourdough discard recipe is also very simple and ridiculously delicious, which is about a cup of discard, about a cup of grated cheese, a little bit of garlic powder, a little bit of salt. Mix that together, spread it really thin on some parchment paper, put it in the oven at 300 degrees for about an hour and a half. Makes the best crackers.
Oh, that sounds so good. I'm definitely going to try that.
They're so good. Yep.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. So, okay, we've talked about preparing and preserving foods. The next one is you can grow and or forage food.
Yeah.
Although you need to know what you're doing when you're foraging
Yep.
and, safety first. Either find someone who's knowledgeable or do not go mushroom hunting,
Yeah.
please.
Mushroom hunting is definitely the last step I think you want to take in the foraging, but I think everybody can pretty safely identify a dandelion, for example, and as long as you can be sure that it wasn't sprayed or a dog didn't pee on it, they're very like you can make a really nice jelly with the flowers. You can make salad with the greens. You can make a coffee with the roots. All very accessible. And so there's lots of, maybe start with dandelion and take it from there.
Right. Yeah, and that coffee, I've had it before and it's delicious.
Yeah, it really is delicious.
And it's not bitter like the,
No,
regular coffee would be. And yeah, even if you can only grow in pots, you can always grow herbs and have fresh herbs available to you, and that really ups your game when you're cooking.
yeah,
And those, a lot of times you can even do those in the winter as long as it's in a sunny spot. And I always see the rosemary plants that are out before Christmas, and I always get one and I keep it alive for as long as I can because I don't know why that's a traditional Christmas thing,
nice.
but it's so nice to have fresh rosemary in the middle of the winter or
Yeah.
any fresh herb in the middle of the winter.
Our thyme made it all through the winter. I was picking thyme like fresh all winter long. I was surprised and amazed, but it was very nice.
That is amazing. It sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
Other things you can do, you can share family recipes and food-based traditions.
Yeah.
Like I said, I do deviled eggs on Easter because that's what my mom did.
Yeah.
With your friends and your family, share those traditions that you know about or that, you grew up with.
Talk to your farmers and or go to farmers markets where they're easy to meet. Often you find foods at a farmers market that you might not find at your supermarket, and most of these farmers have excellent ways to they have recipes for you and good ways to prepare these foods that you might not be familiar with.
Yeah, exactly. The first time I ever saw corn smut
Yeah.
was at my local farmer's market, and everyone was turning their nose up at it. So I asked the farmer, I'm like, what is this? What do you do with it? And he explained it to me and explained how to cook it. And oh my God, it's amazing. It is so delicious. It does not look like it would be delicious, but if you like mushrooms, you will like corn smut.
Ha! I'm gonna keep my eye out for it this year. I've never had it, but I've heard it's really good.
It's so good. Oh, you must try it.
Oh well, yeah, I'll try it.
Yeah. Other things you can do, go to cultural festivals that are going to have food vendors with traditional foods and
Mhm.
check out, different flavors and find out what different cultural foods are like.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked a lot about offerings and
Mhm.
ritual work and including food. And there's, a lot of different things that are traditional or use what's local to you and use what connects you to whatever spirit or, land spirit or deity or whatever it is, or just your own spirituality. Use foods that are meaningful in offerings and ritual work and your prayer.
Yeah.
Another thing, and this is a lot of fun. I have been to a couple of progressive dinners, and this would also apply to potluck. And a progressive dinner is basically where you get together with a bunch of your neighbors that are close by, and you start at one person's house and they do appetizers. And then, you walk next door and go to the next person's house who's maybe doing a salad.
That's not so fun.
Yeah. And so you just go from place to place and everybody has a different part of the meal. And you can, use a culturally or personally relevant dish, maybe a dish you grew up with or a dish from your culture, and explain it to your neighbors and learn about their significant food items. And although this is going to be a lot more involved, a lot of people are brew beer or they ferment different things. They do hard cider.
Yep.
There are even people who are home distilling. And so all of those things can be a really interesting way to get back to how those foods are made or those beverages are made, and understand a little bit more rather than just going and, getting a 6-pack.
Yeah. And it could be much easier than having to distill something yourself. You could make things like what is it, slow gin fizz, if you have access to slow berries. Is that what they're called?
Yes.
All sorts of different liqueur drinks can be made by fermenting, or not fermenting, soaking berries in an alcohol for 6 weeks or so.
Right. You can make flavored alcohols. Like I've had pineapple infused vodka,
Yep.
which is delicious. Do not eat the fruit after you have done that, because it tastes like you're eating straight up grain alcohol. It like pulls all the sweetness out.
It sounds horrible.
Yeah, ask me how I know. I did it, so you don't have to.
Thanks, Tracy.
Okay. Anything else before we sign off?
No, I think this was it. It was another kind of full episode. And as usual, we're very grateful that you were here. If you have any questions or comments, we love to hear them. You can reach us at folkloringpod@gmail.com. And yeah, make sure to follow us, subscribe. We're also now on YouTube, so click subscribe there, and we hope to see you next time.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider giving us a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find Tanya at Folklore Home Companion on Instagram, where she writes about European folklore and traditional life. You can find Tracy at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent and producing the Stories from the Hearth podcast. Hope to talk to you again soon.